almost 10 minutes past 7.
Kia ora, good morning and welcome to this Morning Report post-budget special. I'm Guy Espiner. Thanks for listening, and you can watch today as well. We're live streaming this on video on our website as well as on Facebook, on YouTube and on Freeview Channel 50. Well, Stephen Joyce has delivered his first budget. At the centrepiece, a $2 billion families package aimed at lifting incomes for those on low and middle incomes. With me in the studio to discuss all this today, Bernard Hickey, Heather Roy and David Slack will get all their analysis on the budget shortly. But firstly, to the man himself, Stephen Joyce, the Finance Minister. He says his families package will give 1.3 million families an average of $26 extra per week. I spoke to him just a little bit earlier this morning and began by asking him what difference that would make to those families.
Well, obviously it will vary depending on the family circumstances, but I think it will be particularly helpful for families with young children with low incomes, and particularly helpful for those that are struggling with perhaps high housing costs and have less left in their incomes after housing costs. And that's what it's designed to do, particularly with the accommodation supplement and the changes to the family tax credits.
Some of those increases for larger families in areas like Auckland are pretty significant, aren't they? We ran a scenario of an Auckland family, 3 children under 13 on $45,000, getting $70 odd in the Working for Families, $140 in the accommodation supplement, leaving them over $200 a week better off. Was that the intention, to target it quite directly at those lower income people facing housing stress?
Yes, and I wouldn't claim they'd get all of that, because they might, in their situation, already be getting some temporary additional support. So an element of what they'd be doing in terms of the accommodation supplement would in effect be getting more regularly what they're probably claiming or getting from MSD in their situation anyway. So, but yeah, most of it, yep, that's absolutely right.
So what are the more realistic scenarios of getting...
Well, about a quarter of the accommodation supplement comes back in terms of reductions in temporary support. So you can't do it on an individual basis.
But $150 odd dollars net,
yeah, I'd
better
say at
off,
least, yeah.
That can happen?
Yes, it definitely can happen, yeah.
Okay. On your own analysis, 50,000 children were taken out of being in a situation where they were on less than...
Their families were, yeah.
Their families were on less than the median household income.
Yeah.
Half the median income.
Yep.
So are you saying you've lifted 50,000 children out of poverty? Is that the shorthand way to put it?
It's always hard to say whether it's poverty, because there's so many different measures. This is the OECD measure, and it's 50% of the median income. It does shift 50,000 children and families above that. So yes, you could say that.
Are you saying that?
No, I'm not pushing that in particular. There's lots of different reasons why families struggle, but it's a measure of the impact that has on families.
How many are left then?
It's about 90,000 in that measure, which is still significant. Of course, you'll never get everybody above 50%, 50% of the median income, because it keeps moving up. But it's a sign that actually a good third move above straight away, and there's some other things in there that will help.
So 90,000 children left in poverty in that measure. And I know it's a loaded word, that there are different definitions on. But on the measure we're using this morning, 90,000 left there.
At least on the face of it. But as I say, the median has also moved up. So some of those that are now below the median are still going to be better off as families.
Because you could, you know...
And even those that don't get over the line, all of them get something, get improved situation.
For sure, and there'll be a lot of people who say, look, good on you, it was a good move to do, fair enough. But there'll also be people who say, look, this is a rich country now, with options, with surpluses. Why didn't you go the whole hog and try and leave almost no child in poverty?
Well, it's a challenging thing to do. As you've said already, there's some really big increases involved in that. I think it's a really good step. It makes a very big change to these people and to all people actually on lower incomes. I mean, the average across lower incomes is considerably higher than the $26 a week. And I think it's a situation where you look again, and I think there's more things that we should do in a couple of years' time when we've got more opportunity. So it's certainly not the end of the story. I think it's a good progress step on the story, and it goes to show what you can do if you get a strong economy that's delivering that sort of tax base, that you can start to make those choices. And I think that's, I'm very, very proud and very pleased to be able to do that.
You also say that 20,000 have been lifted out of severe housing stress by this budget, and we've talked about how that is and why that is. How many does it leave in housing stress?
Still a significant number. I think it's around about the 100,000 mark, and is measured by less than $180 a week after housing costs. But
100,000 people in severe housing stress in New Zealand?
well, as measured in that particular way. Again, they're rather loaded measures, but it certainly helps in that respect. And I think
that's a lot of people left in that pretty tough situation, though,
well,
isn't it?
and again, I think we've got to let the accommodation supplement work its way through the system, because, as I said to you, it's all done individually. It's a little bit hard to see. We'll be watching very closely to see what happens to the temporary additional support, which is one way of seeing who's affected, who's still affected. But it's about make some changes, see how it goes. I think they're very, very good changes, and effectively they lift the rent subsidy significantly, as you pointed out. Sometimes $110, $150 a week for some families, and it's going to make some really good progress.
Sure. Your critics will say what's happened here is you're trying to patch up and trying to repair some fundamental problems which aren't addressed. 100,000 people left in housing stress, partly because of the lack of supply and because of the real escalation in house prices and in rents, especially in our big cities like Auckland. So
there's two things here, if I can. One is absolutely we've got to increase supply, and if supply is increasing, it's increasing quite significantly actually, but it's not yet at the point where it's made up for what was quite a big hole from around 2005 to 2010. You're absolutely right, we've got to keep on building houses. We've got 250,000 people working in construction at the moment. That's a record for New Zealand. And the numbers are still going up in terms of consents and building activity. And we've got to make sure that continues. And we had that program that Amy Adams announced, which is going to lay over the top of that. So I'm confident that's heading in the right direction. It can never happen fast enough, but it's heading in the right direction. It came off a low base in 2010. On terms of the cost of housing, unfortunately, one of the biggest challenges we've got is interest rates. So which people like when it's their mortgage, but of course what happens is that interest rates drive high asset prices and high housing prices.
That. And you've made that point strongly before. Is there anything in this budget which makes it easier for someone to buy their first house?
Well, yep. Firstly, that big boost in supply, which, as I say, Amy Adams announced that we're doing with the Auckland Housing Program, that will come through in terms of making it easier. Obviously, the income changes for people that are saving for a house, it contributes to that.
If you look
and importantly, that accommodation supplement helps people on
which we've
high
talked
rents.
about. But the budget is talking about a 7.8% rise in house prices over the next 12 months. That's what the forecast is. Now, that's a lot higher than incomes, isn't it? So the gap between what we earn and what we pay for housing is increasingly getting away.
But people don't pay cash for houses. It's actually the rent and the interest costs that actually is the cost that people bear from their incomes.
They need in many cases they need 20% deposit. What do you think they get that from?
That's right, but again they don't buy it in cash out of their salary. My point is that people save for that, and actually somebody.
Are you trying to claim that people's incomes are not related to how affordable a house is?
No, I'm not. I'm just saying that the way you positioned it was that the house prices are going up faster than incomes, which they are, but actually you don't have to pay the full ticket price for a house up front. Look, I'm not saying it's not challenging. I'm just saying in terms of what we've got to achieve for people is the ability to save more. Well, actually, a couple now, on two of them on the average wage, it's an extra couple of $1,000s a year, which they can choose to put away if they can. In terms
but
of
if house prices are going up by 8% in Auckland, in many cases that'd be $60,000, $70,000.
No, but they're not going up. They're actually flat in Auckland at the moment, flat to falling. They have been over the last 8 to 9 months. If you look at those housing predictions, you'll find that most of that prediction has occurred outside Auckland.
Fair enough. That is a national average, and it has flattened back down a little bit. Yeah. If I look at the bigger picture in the budget, you promised, as campaign manager and as a minister in this government for near on a decade, a brighter future.
Yeah.
A brighter future for New Zealanders. I put it to you that what you've delivered is a future where it makes it a little bit easier to pay the landlord the rent, but no chance of buying into the property-owning democracy.
Oh, I think that's a bit too cynical, actually, if I may say so. I think this particular budget actually does a huge amount. It shows what's possible to do when you have a strong economy which is delivering surpluses which the government then gets to allocate. So very big investments, for example, in infrastructure, big investments in public services, and big investments in people's incomes. So I think those things are all important. In terms of the housing situation, the supply response is absolutely critical, and that's what we're seeing now. Actually, it's been building off a low base since 2010. That's one important thing. But also, we're dealing in an unfortunately tight time in terms of asset prices. This is a world problem. And that's why I do counsel people just to not try and get themselves in too deep, because unfortunately at some point interest rates will come up. In this budget, the forecast is not for a little while yet, but all the signs are interest rates will come up and the supply response will grow, and that means the housing market will correct over time. But I agree, it's not in balance at the moment.
Two quick political things to finish this interview on. Firstly, New Zealand First and the Greens, have they given an undertaking to the government that they will support these tax changes?
No, that was all done on the floor of the House last night. They've decided to vote for it. Obviously, we welcome that.
So you have the support for these tax changes from New Zealand First and from the Greens?
Yeah, it seems that way. But as I say, it wasn't engineered that way.
Are you pleased about that?
Well, I think it shows that they actually, it's grudging support as you'd expect. They're opposition parties, but they've shown that actually they believe that this is a step in the right direction. Okay. I think it will be, I must say, fascinating to see Labor out campaigning against them and Greens out campaigning for them. I don't know quite how that works.
Those people we've talked about, the low-income people in the larger households in Auckland under real pressure that get something of a break from this budget, do you expect those people to vote for you?
Oh, look, we weren't. I'm just not thinking about it in those terms.
Come on.
No, generally not.
You weren't thinking about the election when you delivered this budget?
Well, in the broader sense, yes, but no, not in terms of these particular families. They'll vote the way they want to vote, but hopefully they can see that that we're actually doing something to help them in their situation. I mean, I was very pleased to watch the TV news last night and saw the families there and saw how pleased they were with that change, and actually. That's something that this government's wanted to do for a long time, and this is the first year we've been able to do it. I mean, people say, well, it's not enough and you're catching up, but actually our books have never been in this sort of shape, which allows us to make these sorts of steps, and I was very pleased that we had the opportunity to do that.
Is it a step that's going to win you a fourth term?
I literally don't know. We'll find out after September 23rd.
September 23rd, of course, election day. That was the Finance Minister, Stephen Joyce. I spoke to him a little earlier this morning. Let's bring in our panel now. Have with us Heather Roy, a former ACT MP and Minister, who currently chairs the Advertising Standards Authority and Medicines New Zealand. Welcome to you, Heather.
Thank you.
Also with me, the financial journalist at Newsroom, Bernard Hickey. Good morning to you. Thanks for coming in. And David Slack, political commentator and satirist as well. We ended that interview on the politics, so let's start with the politics. Politically, Heather, how did you see this playing out?
Oh, I think that it was a pretty good budget actually, and it's one that Michael Cullen would have been pretty pleased to have delivered, I would have thought. The question that sort of arises for me is, does this actually change the way the election's going to play out? And there wasn't much there for Winston's people. I think that he's still going to be a major player in the election, and that will be very interesting just to see how that rolls through.
David?
Yeah, if I were living in Auckland, looking at my choices, I wouldn't think that much had changed at all. And the front and centre anxiety is the affordability of houses. Overall, I think, my objection to this is that you've got people with maybe their heart in the right place, but essentially what they're doing is it's the middle of winter. They've got the heat pump on full, but they've got all the doors and the windows open, and they just keep pushing up the heat pump. And until we have a fundamental change in the way we deal with housing affordability, I think this is still a very uneasy and precarious position for the government. And I'm just waiting to see somebody produce something that is an awful lot like the Labor government did in the 30s, where they essentially said, if the housing market is dysfunctional, if the mighty market that's supposed to know what it's doing becomes maniacal, you step out from it.
So you're going full Savage?
Absolutely.
Full Michael Joseph Savage?
Don't spend $1.4 billion a year on accommodation supplements, because that is just fueling the runaway mania of the market. Instead, go back to the proposition of of building and providing affordable property for people to live in, regardless of what return it's showing. Forget about looking for a return. Understand that your return you want is a social return, and that's far more important.
Bernard, you look at the housing market very, very closely. What impact do you think that this will have? I suppose you could argue that it may put some more money into the pockets of landlords if they push the rent up on the back of the accommodation supplement rises.
Yeah, that's one of the big questions from this budget. Will the $400 million extra going in accommodation supplements just pump up rents? The government says, well, we're adding some supply, but is it enough? And that's one of the weaknesses of this budget, and you could argue this government, and actually previous governments of the last 10, 20 years, they haven't built enough supply. And we're still going to have this debate at the election about who's going to build more houses. And at the moment, as we saw from the announcement from the government 2 weeks ago, they're going to build around about 7,000 affordable houses over the next 10 years. And the opposition are promising to build 50,000.
Meanwhile, though, as he said in the interview, Auckland's flattened out.
Well, it has for now, because of the changes to the LVR requirements and because banks are being a bit more cautious. But as we've seen, Auckland has a housing shortage of 40,000 and growing at a rate of 5,000 to 6,000 a year. And certainly this budget doesn't solve that supply issue. It doesn't seek to. Deals with the symptoms of the crisis, which is higher rents. And the question is now, is that lump of extra money for accommodation supplement going to simply turn into rent increases? We all hope not, and it may buy the government a little bit of time, but still it doesn't address that supply issue.
They have targeted well, though, people who are really struggling at the moment.
Let's look at that and dig into it, because I thought that was pretty interesting what he was saying there. They don't like to use the word poverty, but effectively that's the shorthand for it, right? He's effectively saying that this lifts 50,000 children out of poverty. That's a big chunk, you know, possibly 30% of reduction. But he interestingly did say 90,000 left in poverty.
And this is what I was getting at when I was talking about turning up the heat pump but still having all of the doors and windows open. There are a whole lot of specific things you could be doing. There was the Commissioner for Children's report a few years ago that set out many specific things they could be doing.
He said, though, he wanted a 10% reduction in child poverty. Do you remember that? And everyone was hammering John Key because he wouldn't sign up for it. He's just had a finance minister who has taken 30% of people out of poverty.
That's a comforting step forward. But I think, you know, I'm always a little wary of that kind of proposition when it's not underpinned by good policy, substantive policy that's going to be enduring. They have quite a habit of doing just enough to get a headline that says we've made moves forward, but not something that's sustainable and it will endure. And I want to see more of those measures that were recommended implemented.
I think it is a pretty effective targeting. When you look at how they've triangulated the threshold changes, the accommodation supplement and working for families, they have really turned the fire hose of cash down towards that low to middle income area and really effectively gone for the people who are in the most stress with housing. And
I agree. The targeting is particularly effective, I think, and I think they will achieve what they're trying to do there. And look, 50,000 less children in poverty, whatever the definition of poverty is a good thing. It is hard to argue with. Now, one of the things that I would criticise them for, and you're never going to see this in an election year, I don't think, but what about student loans? You know, student loans are still interest-free if you stay in New Zealand. That creates an inequity amongst all of those who don't go and study and receive a student loan. They could be tackling those things, and we're still seeing the other elephant in the room is we've just given Bob Jones, or the government's just given Bob Jones an extra $13 a week. He doesn't need that to live, you know. I would rather that money was being used to help.
Well, this is
really children out of
interesting
poverty.
Because I want to come back to politics here, because it seems to me that if any ground is opened up with this budget, it is on the right. For your old party, the ACT Party, you know, who are saying, look, you know, or in Jenny Shipley's words, we shouldn't be giving so much middle-class welfare.
That's right.
And I presume that that's your stance. Is this an opportunity for the genuine right of New Zealand politics? Yeah,
well, I think the opportunity does exist there. You're right. It has opened up that field. And the Working for Families changes, National vigorously opposed that when they were put in place by the Labour government, but have done very little to come back from that position. A really brave government that was confident about where they were going, I think, would actually lower tax rates across the board and try and get rid of some of that middle-class welfare, which creates huge churn and loses about 10% every time it goes through the cycle.
Actually, just one thing, because you've just mentioned it, Heather, that I was going to remark upon, that we're being told that they've done a very generous reduction in tax. What they've actually done is something that has been done in budgets for many, many years, which is adjust the tax bands.
Yeah, bracket creep
and it
is the
didn't,
policy.
it didn't used to be presented as
A tax cut.
Yeah.
And I think that's
And
kind
it
of
is.
over-egging on their part to suggest
yeah.
There is a
they've
good case to put in place an automated shifting of that threshold that goes up with average
CPI.
wages, as we do with New Zealand superannuation.
Yeah.
And you'd get rid of this, annual debate about let's move the thresholds.
Yeah.
You just have it automatically adjust. Look, the other interesting thing I thought from Stephen Joyce this morning was, he's lifted 20,000 people out of severe housing stress. And that's the definition he's using. And he said on the record, in public radio, that 100,000 people, 100,000 New Zealanders are left in severe housing stress.
That's quite a concession you've managed to get out of the Finance Minister there. That's the first time they've acknowledged those two areas of the numbers in poverty who are children and also the numbers in housing stress. And it shows that there's still a big amount of work to be done. Stephen Joyce said yesterday at the lockup that there is going to be room come 2020 on the existing debt track for the government to do more, and that will be part of the debate in the election. What will be the next step come 2020 before the next election if they get back in? What will they do with particularly housing? Again, another look at working for families, maybe some tax changes, and certainly on the infrastructure side. The one thing that was really missing from yesterday was a real attack on the infrastructure side. He previewed that in a couple of weeks they're going to look at PPPs.
Yeah,
and
but
new
on
measures.
his, and I'll bring you guys in on this housing stress thing too, but just briefly on the capital spending, on the infrastructure spend, according to the pie charts he put up yesterday, well, no, they weren't, they were bar graphs, they weren't pie charts. They said that the spending in 08 on infrastructure was about 2 billion and it was now 4 billion. So he's not doing nothing on that front, is he?
There has been a significant increase. It's a 40% increase. But the question is, we have had a couple of decades of underinvesting in infrastructure. We've also had a population shock, a 7% increase in our population in the last 4 years. 350,000 people have just rocked up or have been born. And that has put intense stress, particularly on Auckland's infrastructure. And they are playing catch up with infrastructure. And the question is, are they doing enough? And certainly around Auckland, the funding problems, which have restricted the council and stopped a lot of housing development, still haven't been solved. We didn't get news on the Housing Infrastructure Fund, and he's still, although we'll hear about it in 2 or 3 weeks, to deal with the issue of how to inject more funding into that infrastructure needed to cope with all those people.
Okay, the housing stress, I want to get some comments from you guys, David and Heather, on this, and then I want to wrap this up looking again at politics because we've got a campaign coming up. Severe housing stress, still 100,000 people, David, in that position.
That scenario you discussed with the Minister where essentially a family has 40,000. It's supporting how many children did you say? 3? Or
I think there was three children in that family in that scenario.
And essentially, that package he outlined means they get another 10,000 a year. Just imagine trying to live in Auckland, even with that extra money. I think it's untenable, and I really fret that we're just too far behind in making life even tolerable, let alone sustainable for so many tens of thousands of people. And it seems to me that what's really missing here is some sort of broader recognition of what in the hell we're trying to do.
You're looking for regional development here, and I think that you guys are, Dave and Heather, on different sides of the political spectrum, but I think you both...
We've got some agreement in this issue,
on
particularly.
that issue, yeah.
I mean, I think that what we're seeing is it trying to be a propping up of people living in Auckland, and are we not better to start thinking about how we can move some of those people who don't necessarily need to live in Auckland out to the provinces or other centres? There is some value in looking at that. The government could be providing some incentives, and I think particularly of immigrants come to Auckland because it's convenient, but the highest housing prices and accommodation in the country. Why don't we encourage them to go to the provinces when they come, say for the first 5 years of the time that they're here? And
where all that existing infrastructure is spare
it's there,
and ready
it's
to be
there.
taken up.
Bernard doesn't agree with us on this,
We
but
actually need to...
You're a big
but I
city
do
guy, aren't you?
think-
That's right.
Yeah.
We need to double down on
The
Auckland.
sucking sound of big cities.
That's right.
I'm not sure that's healthy for New Zealand.
Well, it certainly is healthy for the economy in growing the economy. Big cities make us wealthier. If they're efficient and affordable to live in, they generate wealth.
Okay,
And
we're running out of time. I just want a quick last word from all of you on the politics of it. David, a vote-winning budget for National?
No, I don't think it changes much, and I'm waiting to see somebody who says, here's a broader goal for New Zealand, here's how we create a kind of economy and society that has a role for everybody where they can afford to live in good health and in an environment that's sustainable, and we've got no plan for any of that. And I think if we were actually clear about those goals, we would actually be able to pull policy around it and things would transform.
I think it's a consolidation, really, of the areas that they've managed to move into. Hefty focus on what they think the election issues are going to be, so housing affordability, those sorts of things. But, other things have been left behind, and things like medicines, for example, some injection of money into the Pharmac budget, but still not enough to clear the waiting list. That medicines that PTAC, the technical committee, have approved, still not being able to be funded. So things like that have been left.
Quick final word from you, Bernard.
It's an effective act of political jiu-jitsu. They were lunged at with some policies. They took them in through the opposition, but the issue of housing affordability has not been dealt with in full. There's more work to be done.
Thanks very much, Bernard. Bernard Hickey, their financial journalist at Newsroom. Also speaking this morning to David Slack, political commentator and satirist, and Heather Roy, former acting MP and minister who currently chairs the ASA and Medicines New Zealand, obviously earlier speaking to the Finance Minister too, Stephen Joyce. But for now, it's back to you in Wellington, Susie.
Thanks very much, Guy. And coming up before 8 o'clock on Morning Report, UK police stop sharing intelligence with their American counterparts after the leak of forensic photographs from the Manchester bombing. Also, Donald Trump tells off his NATO allies, saying they're not paying enough for their defence. And a successful launch for Rocket Lab will be speaking